We're going to do, we haven't done this in a month or two. We're going to back up and sort of catch ourselves up in a quick way from the very beginning. And then we're going to move forward today. Today class is going to be a little different. We're going to actually dig into some source material text and do some text study. So get back to our Tuesday night roots, which for the better part of 5 years was ongoing text study of the Talmud. A number of Talmud alums here. So, in fact, we're going to be looking at Talmud. Tractate on divorce, but we're not talking divorce. Okay, so the whole idea of Story of Us, and this is the part we repeat every week, so you probably could repeat it to me at this point. The whole idea of Story of Us is that there have traditionally been two ways of telling the Jewish story. There is what I've called the internal way of telling the story, where Jewish history begins with Abraham and Sarah. And then there is, we'll use a little German here, Wissenschaft des Judentums. Has anyone heard this phrase before? It's very close to the only German phrase that I can speak. The academic study of Judaism. It arises in the 17 and 1800s, and actually we're going to do a fair amount of looking at it when we get to that moment in Jewish history. Which is still, 2,000 years away from where we are in our history right now. But that is the other method, which is to say to study about Jewish history in external and academic approach. The problems with the external and academic approach is it doesn't provide any meaning, right? The whole point is history and not memory, history and not mythology. And myth is one of these words we keep using over and over again in Story of Us. And then you have the internal approach. And the problem with that is it's all mythology with very little actual history to it. And one of the real problems with that is that the version of the Jewish story that we tell today in the Orthodox world is the authentic ancient version of the Jewish story is incredibly different from the version of the Jewish story that was authentic and ancient that was told 200 years ago and 200 years before that, and so on and so forth. So the goal of Story of Us is to take the earliest people who imagined themselves as us. This is, of course, before even the word Jew would have existed, and to ask the question of who were they? What are the stories that they told themselves about where they came from and what was important and what were their values? What were their sacred texts? And what were their values that they tried to live their lives by? And then with Story of Us, each week we've been trying to trace those questions through time and through Jewish space. Makes sense, yeah? Any thoughts or questions on that? Just interrupt if you... Okay. So we started our Story of Us around 1250 BCE. Just as a reminder, the further back we go, the more we are relying on historical inference rather than actual strong data. And our goal here is to tell a story. That really is the goal, to tell a story of who we are, of what it means to be a Jew through history. So particularly early on, we are prioritizing in some ways story over nuance. So just keep that in mind, that certainly you could open up all sorts of academic books and get 15 different theories for most of the pieces that we're just skipping through like they're almost fact. Okay, 1250 BCE. We started by looking at geography, looking at the north of what we now call Israel, in the area, ironically, that we'd now call the West Bank, primarily a Palestinian area, other than settlers. And we looked at these folks, hey, Avi, we looked at these folks who had a story that they told themselves of being descendants from enslaved people who had fled from Egypt. Now, when we say Egypt, it's important to remember that's the great Southern Empire. So much of the history that we've been dealing with is about the Southern Empire, Egypt, and the Northern Empire, which at this point would have been the Assyrian Empire, but goes through a few different changes. So they said that they came from the great Southern Empire, from Egypt, that they were part of a slave rebellion, and there might even be some Egyptian sources that speak to this. They make their way to this mountainous region of the West Bank, and they tell a story about themselves that is different from their neighbors. They, amongst other things, we don't find pig bones buried in these areas or in the refuse piles of these areas, even as we do in surrounding communities that, for all intents and purposes, are identical. The same foods, the same, other than pig bones, the same languages, the same methods of religious observance is not quite the right word, cultic activity, if you want to be technical, the same way of killing animals and offering them to their gods before they then eat them as barbecue. So that's happening in the north, and they have a main deity. These people are in no way monotheistic. The deity of El Elyon, the god of high places, which makes sense when you think about the Moses stories and the Exodus stories, where do we go? Where does Moses go to commune? Up on a mountain. El Elyon, the god of high places. It's a phrase we still have in our liturgy in the Aleinu and in some other places. Meanwhile, in the south, not in the agricultural settled north, but in the Bedouin south, we have an entirely different group of people whose story that they tell themselves is that they came from the northern empire, the Assyrian Empire, from Ur, from the Hittites, from whatever group we're talking about, and fled Mesopotamia. That's the word you would have learned in middle school, and came to this area led by their god, a different god. This is the god that comes to be the proper name of the Jewish deity of eventually Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh. But these are different groups with different cultures, and the one thing that they could agree on is that they weren't the same. In about the year 1000 BCE, there's a southern warlord, chieftain, who's able to consolidate power across the south. He's able to siege and sack the city of Jerusalem, which was a northern fortress city designed to protect the northern farmers from southern shepherds who, when there wasn't enough rain and there was an area for their flocks to graze on, would bring all of their flocks north to graze on the northern farmland. And so as this is happening, as the city is sieged, then the north is open to this warlord, this chieftain who had been declared king over all the south. He's able to quickly conquer and occupy much of what we think of as being the north of Israel. So remember last week we spent a fair amount of time looking at various maps to show that actually the boundaries of what we're talking about are radically different, even a few decades apart from each other. But this warlord chieftain who's been declared king over the south and then is an occupying king of the north, his name is, of course, King David. So we looked at texts that made their way into the Hebrew Bible that are polemics against David by northerners. We looked at the story of David and Bathsheba as a northern polemic against this southern occupying force. This kingdom that he'd put together falls apart pretty quickly within a couple generations, and then the geopolitics of the greater world enter in again. The Assyrian Empire, now we're getting into the 700s BCE or so, the Assyrian Empire is beginning to crack, it's beginning to fall apart. In these two kingdoms, in the north and the south, Israel and Judea, Israel in the north stops paying its taxes. They think that it has fallen apart, and they are like 50 years too early, and there is nothing more dangerous than an empire in decline, and the north is destroyed. We talked about this as being sort of the lost 10 tribes, and in fact we talked about, if you really want to find the descendants of the lost 10 tribes, you don't go looking in Jamaica with the Rastafarians or India, or it's the Palestinians and the Syrians and the Lebanese and the Jordanians and the folks who live in this whole area. And this is really, I think, actually an important moment to just back away and talk Story of Us again, because they stop being a part of us because they stop telling themselves a story that is our story. That's what changes here. We've compared it to, if you can imagine, someone discovering that their great-great-great-great-grandmother was Jewish. But for all the generations from here to there, they've been Catholic, living in El Salvador. I had a girlfriend in college who that was her story.
It's good to incorporate.
Yeah, exactly. Actually, they had this custom. This is a tangent, but it's wild. In their family, very Catholic family, that the women would go into a closed closet every Friday night and light 2 candles and then close the door.
Oh,
Right? That these customs that stuck through long after even the memory of what it was about. But anyways, right? She was in no way Jewish. There was nothing Jewish about her. She was, and yet that's entirely because the story that her and her ancestors had told themselves was no longer a Jewish story. So I wanted to back away there because that is the whole premise. That is the whole thesis of the story of us. That ultimately what it means to be a Jew is not that your mother was Jewish or your father. It's not that you converted in a halachic and we've got that form for you. But it's that you tell yourself this story as your own. That in the end, that's what it means to be a Jew. Okay, makes sense? Any thoughts before we keep skirting through our background and our history that we've done? Okay, so this destruction of the northern kingdom by the Assyrians doesn't happen all at once, so a whole bunch of the wealthy people are able to get out. Some things don't change, and they flee south, primarily into Jerusalem, and in fleeing south, they bring with them their Moses stories. They are incredibly welcomed in Jerusalem in the same way that everyone everywhere welcomes large groups of foreign refugees, which is to say they weren't very welcome in Jerusalem. But within 100 years, 150 years or so, there's a fair number of people who came from both stories and who have begun to integrate all of these stories together. This moment we looked at as sort of the Joseph moment, where the Joseph narrative, which is the longest unbroken novella, I think is probably the right word, in the Torah, connects these 2 disparate bodies of mythology. That's a technical term, but the Moses stories, which exist on their own, and the Abraham, Sarah, matriarch, patriarch stories, which exist on their own. We get so used to reading them together as one continuous narrative that we miss that actually they have almost nothing to do with each other, and they don't naturally point towards each other, except Joseph makes them point. Joseph is the bridge that explains how we moved from being a family to a people. Make sense? Mm-hmm. Okay. 620 or so, King Josiah comes to power, and this is the golden age of ancient Jerusalem. King David was, for all practical purposes, ruling over a backwater Jerusalem. Tiny, dirty, not particularly built up. It is the Josianic era, King Josiah, 620 BCE, that is the golden age. And in fact, they're the ones who begin telling their own story in a sacred way. And who do they point to as their sacred ancestor? They point to David. So they're the ones who tell all of these stories. And in fact, they take the Moses stories, they take the Exodus narrative, and they turn it into their own version as well. The name of the book that they write, which is a Southern Jerusalem-centered retelling of the northern mythologies of Moses. That was a mouthful there, but hopefully everyone followed. The name of this book is, anyone remember? Deuteronomy.
Oh, of course.
This is Deuteronomy.
Okay.
And in fact, we looked at 2 Kings 22, where the priests in the temple are bought off in order to discover this book. Okay, so we've gotten through the 620s, and at this point, the Assyrian Empire, which has collapsed, has begun to be reformed by a new controlling power, by the Babylonians instead. This is essentially the same empire. There are some boundaries that are a little different east to west, but essentially we are talking about a new ethnic group of people, a new region that is controlling and is in charge of this area. Okay, make sense? So the Babylonians have come, they are reforming this empire, and they come through to wage war on the Great Southern Empire. And this becomes the theme really of the next 600 years that we look at, is the Northern Empire and the Southern Empire, and the ways that Israel, Judea, this region, us as a people, become this sort of tiny little area that's the border region between the two, that is constantly being fought over and going back and forth and back and forth. So the Babylonians come through the great Northern Empire, and they have this policy when they take over a region, as they do in Judea, of cutting off the head, of taking all of the scribes and the nobility and the educated and the elite and carrying them off into slavery in their homeland. This works as a great brain drain, by the way. This is one of the reasons they do it. Sort of imagine India has a lack of doctors. Do people know this today? India doesn't have enough doctors. America has a lot of doctors who grew up in India. Those two things are related to each other. Similarly, that's one of the great benefits that the Babylonians have, is all of these little regions. And let's remember that Judea is a little unimportant region. We tell history from our perspective like we are the center from it, but it's like telling the story of World War II from the perspective of Micronesia or something. We're just not that important in the global scheme of things. Certainly weren't in the past. Okay, so, sorry, I'm losing my train of thought with the...
We all are.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Okay, so Babylon comes through and they carry us off into exile, into enslavement. Probably estimates are between 10 to 30% of the population is carried off into Babylonian enslavement. My guess is, looking at the sources and looking at the scholarly consensus, it's closer to 10% than it is to 30%, but there you go. We're not there for long, because very quickly the Babylonian Empire is replaced again by a new king, by the Persians. The Persians take over from the Babylonians. And they have a very different method of controlling and running their empire. Whereas the Babylonians were focused on central control, the Persians are much more interested in creating local autonomous states that are under their control, and where the leadership of these states is directly tied to the Persians, and certainly that everyone pays their taxes, which is what they really care about. But it's a different policy. And so this is what we get with the Persians. And so many of the people who had been living in Babylon, who had been thriving in Babylon, because it's only for a short time that actually we are enslaved there. Pretty quickly we stop being enslaved and we turn into an elite upper crust. I've mentioned it before, but this is how it goes, because the kings of this era knew to treat captured nobility well, because pretty soon you could be the captured nobility. So this elite upper crust that has become deeply tied to the Persians are sent back to impose rule and order on this backwater province of Judea. And that's what it becomes, is it becomes a province, a state within the Persian Empire of Judea. And it is run by Ezra and Nehemiah and their friends, by those who are the most connected and most a part of the Persian circle of influence. Any questions or anything? Okay, we're still reviewing, right? Okay, so this keeps going, and they are the ones, the Persians, who insist on writing an official version of the law. This is one of the ways that they operate throughout their empires, that each of the provinces have their official version of the law. All of which is to say that it is the Persians and their demand for this that results in the writing of the Torah in a final official version that would be recognizable to us today. So I very much think that if you could go back in time to 400, 450 BCE, that's where we're at now, you would find a version of the Torah that, outside of some grammatical errors and maybe a few verses here and there, is identical to what we see today. We good? Zoomers, any thoughts, any questions? Okay. So the Persians give way, of course, to the Greeks, to Alexander the Great, who makes his way through this entire region. And what Alexander the Great does is he combines the great southern empire of Egypt with the great northern empire of Assyria, Babylon, Persia, whatever we are talking about, and is really the first one to combine these into a greater empire. Of course, the Romans are going to come and they're going to add other pieces here as well. So Alexander the Great creates this empire that stretches from the Greek peninsula through to North Africa, particularly in Egypt, through Israel, all the way up into what we would now think of as Lebanon and Syria and Iran and Iraq and Turkey, and this is the range of Alexander the Great's empire. And unlike the Persians, unlike the Babylonians or the Assyrians, he believes he's civilizing the world, and that by bringing Greek culture, he's liberating people from their backwaterness, from being barbarians, is essentially his view. And interestingly, by and large, the Judeans are pretty excited about this. In fact, unlike lots of other places that are conquered, the high priest in Judea at the temple in Jerusalem is very excited about the bathhouses in particular. We have documentary evidence of just how much he liked the bathhouse and showed up at the grand opening of it and helped to dedicate it and all of these sorts of things. And you can imagine that there were different reactions and different responses to how this worked in different parts of the empire. But in Judea, in what we would now call Israel, it was quite welcomed. Part of this is that it was taken for granted that we would have an overlord. There was no notion that we could exist independent of the great powers. Again, think Micronesia. And so the new boss was certainly no worse than the old boss. Okay, pretty quickly, Alexander the Great's empire splits and breaks up into three different kingdoms. A kingdom or an empire that exists sort of across Greece, one that is the old northern empire of Assyria, Persia, Babylon, whatever we're calling it. That's called the Seleucid Empire, exactly. It's Greek, but not run from Greece. It's run by ethnically Greek people who often are educated in Greece, who are sent off, and includes a number of people who come from Greece to help run it. By the way, does anyone know the name of Alexander the Great's tutor who educated him? Aristotle. Yeah. And everyone saw, I think I mentioned it, but they found Alexander the Great's dad's tomb recently, and brother, and actually, they found those bodies and were able to identify. It's wild to think that we could have bodies from that long ago that are identifiable, right? Very recent. I mean, within the last month or two, they found this, or at least they announced the discovery of it. Meanwhile, in the south, we have the Ptolemaic Empire. Which is to say the Egyptian Greek version of this same thing, also controlled by ethnic Greeks, also with major cities of Greek thought and Greek culture like Alexandria. Israel, Judea, starts flipping back and forth and back and forth and back and forth between these two Greek empires that are fighting against each other, right? The same dynamic we've had this whole time of the Northern Empire and the Southern Empire fighting. In fact, I think I mentioned that there was a 20-year period where we go back and forth seven times between them. Jerusalem goes back and forth 7 times between them in the course of 19 years, around 320 to 300 or so BCE. So we start to see an increasingly divergent set of cultures between Jews, and at this point we can call ourselves Jews, by the way. Post-Persian exile, post-Babylonian exile, the idea of being a Jew emerges because it's an identity that is portable as opposed to being a tribally Judean identity that is based on place. So we're going back and forth and back and forth. And Jews who are living in urban centers become ever more Hellenized and ever more engaged in this great project of Hellenization. And in the rural centers, they're becoming ever more radicalized and ever more conservative and fundamentalist. And we may recognize some of these dynamics from today. In fact, you all are coming to Jeff City. You'll see it tomorrow. So the Hanukkah story, the story of the Maccabees, is really the story of a Jewish civil war between assimilated, educated, Hellenized Jews living in urban centers and rural, fundamentalist, extremist Jews living out in the boonies, in Modi'in, which is today a modern city in Israel, but it's where these folks are coming from. They're able to conquer, they win, they control this region. Again, there's no pretending that we're not a part of these two great empires back and forth also, but they're the ones who end up in control and immediately become one of the most corrupt regimes in Jewish history. I won't make my Netanyahu joke here, but yeah. I guess if I mention that I'm not making the joke, it's like making the joke. Is it? Yeah. The most corrupt regime until the Netanyahu administration is my joke. But so it's so corrupt that we even have copies of letters that were sent by folks in the nobility to the Romans, begging the Romans to come in and liberate us. And pretty soon that happens. Actually, the great northern power, the Seleucids, decides that they are going to conquer Greece, and they fail, and they're forced to pay all these reparations because of it. And the ones who enforce that are the Roman, I guess not the Roman Empire, it's the Roman Republic at that point. But this is really the moment that the Romans come onto the more global scene in this area. Okay, so the last 2 weeks we've looked at the Romans. In the way that we've really described the Romans and the Roman Empire, and this was new to me, looking at a map really helped me understand this in a different way, is that the Roman Empire was a Mediterranean empire. And it's kind of obvious, but I had never conceived of it this way. That the Romans encircle the Mediterranean Sea. That's what their empire is. And in fact, one of the facts I shared last week that stood out is this is the first time in history up to that point where piracy had been eliminated from a region because the Romans control the entirety of the Mediterranean. In some other areas too, right up into the British Isles and things like that. But they're controlling the entirety of the Mediterranean, including this area of Judea, of Israel, of whatever name we're using for it at this moment. Judea would have been the name of the Roman province that they used, though with a Y sound, of course, instead of a J. That's our bad English pronunciation of German J's, which is a Y, which is, again, when we get to the 1800s, we'll deal with all of this. Okay. So the last 2 weeks we've looked at the notion of Roman occupation, and we've particularly looked at the idea that Roman occupation, unlike these other models, was a military occupation, a brutal military occupation that resulted in the same theological extremist military responses that we find everywhere. We've looked at the idea of ISIS, and we forget this, but ISIS, of course, is a theological military response to the American occupation of Iraq. And similarly, we get all of these responses to the Roman occupation of Judea. Now, a lot of times we focus on the temple. This is a symbol, and remember that when we're talking about it, that the temple is a symbol. It's the equivalent of the White House, in the sense that, White House down means America has fallen. The temple in Jerusalem being destroyed means that Jewish civilization has been destroyed. We tend to overemphasize the religious pieces, the cultic pieces, because the people who tell Jewish history, by and large, have been rabbis. That's a problem, right? It really is a problem, because it gives all of us a distorted view of Jewish history, and we're gonna get there. So we look at these groups who are rebelling against Rome, And the language of the rebellion is so often about the corruption and the illegitimacy of the temple. But that's just another way of saying Roman occupation. So in particular, we looked at 4 different groups last week. Now we are almost caught up. We looked at the Sadducees. So Sadducees, when you hear that, you should think the insiders. The Sadducees are the ones who control the temple, meaning those are the ones who the Romans have picked, who are close with the Romans, who are the equivalent of Ezra and Nehemiah, the relationship they had with the Persians. That's what the people who run the temple are to the Romans during this era. And they are the Sadducees. They are the mainstream. They are the political power. And even as during that time period, everyday Judeans, everyday Jews would not have identified most likely with these groups, I think we can label the broad 80% of Jews during this time, certainly Jews living in Judea, as Sadducees. Because most people are going along to get along. Sure, they don't like the Roman occupation, but actually they just need to finish their farming. Actually, they just need to arrange for their daughter's marriage. Actually, they just need to, just need to get along with life. So those are the Sadducees. Any thoughts or questions on them? Make sense? Mm-hmm. Okay, Essenes. Essenes, don't get technical here. In fact, we're going to specifically not get technical. We're going to look at it as an idea rather than a specific group. It probably was a little bit of both. But for our purposes, Essenes are those folks who are going off and escaping from political reality into the wilderness. There's sometimes hermits. There's sometimes ascetics. There's sometimes revolutionaries waiting for a messianic figure. This is also the moment when messianism begins to exist. Messianism as a concept doesn't really exist. I mean, it starts a little earlier than this, but isn't recognizable to us until this moment, until this era. But messianism is not eschatological. It's not about an end of time. It's not about God ordaining discrete periods of history that end with, happily ever after and heaven and these sorts of things. Messianism in this moment is the idea that things are so bad that there is no hope for us to change them. And so we need God's intervention, and God will send someone who will lead a political revolution that will overthrow Rome and replace the political order with the way that it always should have been. The other way of saying it is messianism is a fantasy that God's going to intervene, and in the same way that it went from the Assyrians to the Babylonians to the Persians to the Greeks to the Romans, that it's going to next go to the Jews, that we're going to be in charge of the whole world, and everyone's going to come and be like, oh, you should have been in charge the whole time, and bow down to our God, and all of these sorts of things. So that's messianism, and we get all of these messianic movements that pop up at this time period. We've talked about Yoni the mikveh man, better known as John the Baptist, Honi the circle drawer. We've talked, next week probably we're going to get into Jesus of Nazareth. And again, we're going to look at Jesus and in particular the Gospels as Jewish texts written by fringy Jews in a Jewish context for Jews. That's how we'll look at it when we get there. And so these are all a part of that same sort of messianic movement. So we've got the Essenes out in the desert, like in Qumran, at the Dead Sea Scroll community, though, again, some people say they're not technically Essenes, but we don't care about that right now. Okay, those are our first two groups, Sadducees, Essenes. The next group we talked about are Zealots. And we can put some of these messianic groups in the Zealot groups, and we're going to be looking at a Zealot text today as well. Zealots were focused, they're much closer to ISIS in the sense that they are focused on targeting and murdering either Romans who are in charge or Jews who are collaborating with the Romans. My favorite subgroup of this are the Sicarii, named after the small dagger that they would carry that they could hide in their tunics and would go into sort of gatherings and quickly Julius Caesar style stab collaborators and slip off. What'd you say?
Never mind.
Yeah. Okay. Does this make sense? All these three groups? Okay. The last group, which we only touched on last week, are the Pharisees. And the Pharisees are the early rabbis. So just remember that the Sadducees are the mainstream, and we can throw about 80% of people into this group of Sadducees. It's only the upper middle class who have the luxury of being something other than go along, get along. So it's already a tiny group of people, a fringe of people who can even be involved in any of these sort of more fringy revolutionary movements. And so the Pharisees are one of these movements. And what's distinctive about them is that they say that there was an oral tradition that was given at Mount Sinai along with the Torah. And that this oral tradition has been passed from teacher to student through time, and that they are the keepers of this. What's important about this oral tradition is it's a way of doing and being Jewish that is not dependent on the temple and is not dependent on cultic activities. Cultic activities just means slitting the throats of animals and barbecuing them. I say that like in a joking way, but it's important to remember this, that we tend to think of animal sacrifice within a temple as being, burn up the whole thing for God, but it's much closer to barbecue than it is to burn up the whole thing for God. Almost always, there's some exceptions, almost always you were going to eat most of the meat that you offered, other than a hefty cut, literally, of the meat that would go to the priests. And the priests are in some ways closer to butchers than they are to Catholic priests. Okay. The Pharisees reject the legitimacy of the temple just like these other groups, but they say there is another way of doing this that is ancient and is authentic. And I can't overstate enough how much the 80% would have looked at them and said, "You are ridiculous." Yes, you are ridiculous. It's sort of like we talked about with prophets, when we looked at the prophets, right? In the same way that if you saw someone sitting in a hair shirt in the middle of the town square screaming that the world is going to come to an end, you would roll your eyes at them. Ancient people also would have responded to religious fanatics this way. And so the Pharisees, we hear of things like the Sanhedrin in the Great Court and later tellings in the Talmud 1,000 years later talk about how the king would go to the Great Court and would ask these questions and closer to a clown court than anything else at the time. The Sanhedrin was not a meaningful political entity at this time at all. When we get to Napoleon's era, we'll do another look at all the Sanhedrins through history. So these are the Pharisees. These are the people who eventually become the rabbis, who eventually become the normative form of Judaism. Probably never would have happened if the temple hadn't have been destroyed, but that's going to come a little later. Okay, thoughts, questions? We are totally caught up. I know that was a lot of review today, but hopefully it was helpful also to just reconceptualize all of this as one story instead of the discrete stories that we've been looking at. Thoughts or questions before we dig into a text? I'm looking at Zoom too to see if anyone has anything. Yeah, Nancy.
So I'm wondering, why is it that, you're talking about Messianism. Why is it only this period that we start seeing that?
Yeah, it's a great question. Some of this comes from the Persian influence. Some of it comes from Zoroastrian influences. We see this in the Dead Sea Scrolls with the focus on a great battle between light and dark. But I would also say that there's something about the brutality of the Roman occupation that feeds into this. If you think of Messianism not in its Jewish context or even in its Christian context, I'm trying very hard to avoid the phrase Judeo-Christian because only Christians talk about Judeo-Christian. Right? There's no Jewish romanticism about the great merger of civilizations. So if you think of Messianism broadly in the way that it exists across cultures and times, when things are really bad, Messianism rises. Similarly, actually, and this is, I think, very much part and parcel, we see the idea of literal bodily resurrection of the dead begin to emerge during this period in a meaningful way, really for the first time. And this is one of the great theological differences between the Sadducees and the Pharisees. One of the things we know about them, in fact, is that Sadducees said there is no such thing, that this is silliness. And the Pharisees said, yes, after you die, that there will eventually be a reboot where everyone comes back to life. This is not a heaven, by the way, that we're talking about. We were talking about literal bodily resurrection of the dead in this world, seems to be what they are imagining. But all of these sociologically, psychologically are the result of awful oppression that made hope within this existence close to impossible. So great question, Nancy. Josiah.
Hey, Rabbi. So you were mentioning that there is a group of dagger-wielding revolutionaries called the Sicarii. Is there any connection to the name Judas Iscariot, or is that like a...
Oh, I don't know the answer to that, but that's a great question. And if you discover anything through Google, please let us know.
Sure sounds like it.
Yeah, sure does sound like it. That's a great question, Josiah. Thank you. And actually, Josiah is a PhD in these things, so maybe we don't... You could probably do better than Google.
Wrong historical era, but yeah.
Okay. Any other questions before we jump into a text? Okay, we're going to do this the opposite of how we normally do it. We normally spend a lot of time giving a context for a text, and we're going to look at actually the Talmud. So this is going to be hundreds of years later that this is written and edited. So we're pulling something out of context. But this is the traditional Jewish text on the destruction of Jerusalem. Has anyone studied this before, the story of Kamsa and Bar Kamsa? It's this, the whole story as a whole is great. Because the thesis is that there is, well, the story begins with Kamsa and Bar Kamsa, who have names that are very similar to each other, right? It's so nice that they're not in here. They have names that are very similar to each other, and some noble person in Jerusalem is throwing a huge party and sends an invitation, and I'm going to get this backwards, but means to send it to Kamsa, but the servant accidentally sends it to Bar Kamsa, and it turns out that Kamsa is his friend, but Bar Kamsa is his enemy, and Bar Kamsa gets it and thinks, oh, this is this great moment of rapprochement, how wonderful it is that enemies are becoming friends, and he shows up at the party, and the host of the party is like, I did not invite you, get out of my house. And Bar Kamsa even offers to pay for the whole party and he doesn't do it and gets kicked out. And he's so mad that he gets kicked out that he goes to the Roman authorities and reports on this person. And then it's this whole like slow chain of events that eventually leads to the destruction of Jerusalem because of a party invitation. You may have heard that traditionally it's said that Jerusalem was destroyed on account of baseless hatred between Jews. That's how this story starts. And actually, it's this amazing piece of literature, and we're just going to jump into the middle of it, where you see one piece of spiteful behavior result in another, and in another, and in another. It's the bad day at work, so you come home and you yell at your spouse, who yells at the kids, who kicks the dog, who bites the cat, who burns down Jerusalem. Yes. That's kind of how this works. Okay, we ready to dig in? Mm-hmm. So we're jumping into the middle of this story. It's really out of context, but join us for Tisha B'Av, and we will look at it in some real context. Let me make this big on the screen here. There we go.
It sounds like son of Bar Kamsa.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And the whole point is that, right, they're almost identical to each other. Let me just move my head so you can, I can just move that even better. Okay. So there were certain zealots amongst the people of Jerusalem. You may remember that word zealot, and you know exactly what group we were talking about. I didn't mention one of the real theories about the zealots is that primarily they were made up of rabbis. That the difference between the Pharisees and the Zealots is that they're part of the same movement and disagree on tactics.
Oh, wow.
The rabbinic tradition, the Pharisaical tradition, I think it's fair to say it's not pacifist, but it is fatalist about Roman occupation and does not believe that it is possible for Jews to overthrow the Romans. They were right. I mean, very clearly they read the political situation right. But so they are very opposed to fighting a war. This is why they changed the Hanukkah story into the story of oil lasting instead of a story that could inspire people to revolution and rebellion. Okay. Is there someone here who wants to read for us? Just so you hear someone else's voice?
Sure, I'll start. Ready?
Yeah, just real loud, please.
There were certain zealots among the people of Jerusalem. The sages said to them,
Sages just means the rabbis.
"Let us go out and make peace with the Romans."
Okay.
But the zealots did not allow them to do this. The zealots said to the sages, "Let us go out and engage in battle against the Romans." But the sages said to them, "You will not be successful. It would be better for you to wait until the siege is broken."
So I should have said this, that Jerusalem is being sieged by the Romans at this point, and there's this debate. It's also, we're told, I forget the amount of time, there's some absurd amount of time that the Talmud says there was enough food for 40 years that was sitting in the stores of Jerusalem. So we could have held out, was the whole idea here.
Sounds so familiar. In order to force the residents of the city to engage in battle, the zealots arose and burned down these storehouses. Ambare? Is that the storehouse?
There's going to be a play on words here that's coming, which is why the Talmud's telling us, or why this translation's telling us that.
All right, storehouses of wheat and barley, and there was a general famine.
Okay, we get this great story next that we'll skip over of Marta Bat Betos, who is a wealthy woman who sends out her servant to go get her flour, find the nicest of flour from the market, and they're out of nice flour. So the servant comes back and says, "We're out." He says, "Okay, fine, go get regular flour," and does this. And by the time, each time, asks for something else, and the servant doesn't just buy the other thing, unfortunately, when he's there. And by the end, she has nothing to eat at all. There's no food. But it's a nice way of seeing the way that Jerusalem collapsed. And we have this imagery of it, that there's less and less to eat. And Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, who's going to be our protagonist here in a moment, has this whole story about her that we have. Okay, we're jumping forward. The Gemara relates. Abba Sakara.
I'm passing on the reading.
Abba Sakara was the leader of the Zealots.
Bir Yoneh was the word here.
Okay, of Jerusalem, and the son of the sister of Rabban Yohanan ben Zakkai.
Okay, so Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai is going to be the founder of Rabbinic Judaism as we know it, or the preserver of Rabbinic Judaism as we know it. We'll see it in this story. But it's interesting that the head of the Zealots is his nephew, which again shows you just how tied these groups are.
Okay, Rabban Yohanan ben Zakkai sent a message to him, "Come to see me in secret." He came, and Rabban Yohanan ben Zakkai said to him, "Until when will you do this and kill everyone through starvation?" Abba Sakara said to him, "What can I do? For if I say something to them, they will kill me." Rabban Yohanan ben Zakkai said to him, "Show me a method so that I will be able to leave the city, and it is possible that through this there will be some small salvation."
That becomes the key. This is the language, he's pulling it from the Hebrew Bible as well, right? That there's a shard of Jewish folks who survived the exile.
Abba Sakara said to him, "This is what you should do. Pretend to be sick and have everyone come and ask about your welfare, so that word will spread about your ailing condition. After bring something putrid and place it near you, so that people will say
That you have died and you're decomposing.
and then have your students enter to bring you to burial, and let no one else come in, so that the zealots not notice that you are still light.
You'll read the next line and you'll...
As the zealots know that a living person is lighter than a dead person." Of course.
Doc, is that
I was absent that day.
Yeah, exactly.
Go on.
Please.
Rabbi Yohan ben Zakkai did this. Rabbi Eliezer entered from one side and Rabbi Yehoshua from the other side to take him out. When they arrived at the entrance of the city on the inside, the guards, who were of the faction of the Zealots, wanted to pierce him with their swords in order to ascertain that he was actually dead, as was the common practice. Abba Sakaris said to them, "The Romans will say that they pierced even their teacher." The guards then wanted at least to push him to see whether he was still alive, in which case he would cry out on account of the pushing.
It's pretty comedic, almost, right? Yeah.
Abba Sakaris said to them, "They will say that they pushed even their teacher." The guards then opened the gate, and he was taken out. When Rabbi Yohan ben Zakkai reached there, in other words, the Roman camp, he said, "Greetings to you, the king. Greetings to you, the king." Vespasian said to him, "You are liable for 2 death penalties. One, because I am not a king, and yet you call me a king."
Okay, hold on. Pause for a second. So this is also a Talmudic trope here, that all of a sudden the rabbi shows up with the great famous Roman. And these are famous Romans, right? You probably know these names from Roman history here. So he sneaks out, and then he's like, "Oh, that's Vespasian over there. Let's go hang out." Yep. So he goes and sees Vespasian and says this to him.
Okay. Furthermore, if I am a king, why didn't you come to me until now? Rabbi Yohan ben Zakkai said to him, "As for what you said about yourself, I am not a king."
In truth, you are a king.
In truth, you are a king. If not now, then in the future. As if you are not a king, Jerusalem will not be handed over into your hand.
Okay, we're going to go. This gets. They have all sorts of proof texts and quotes here. If I am a king, why didn't you come to me till now? If a barrel. Vespasian said to him, "If there's a barrel of honey and a snake is wrapped around it, wouldn't they break the barrel in order to kill the snake? In similar fashion, I am forced to destroy Jerusalem in order to kill the zealots within it." Rabbi Yochanan was silent and did not answer. In light of this, they say, "Who turns wise men backward and makes their knowledge foolish?" Right? The idea, could Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai have at this point arranged for Jerusalem to be saved? In the meantime, they were talking. A messenger arrives from Rome and says to him, "Rise, the emperor has died, and you're the new emperor," to Vespasian. So,
Big trouble.
yeah, but also it means that he just prophesied and was immediately correct. So the end of this story is that Yochanan ben Zakkai is offered 3 wishes from the Roman emperor, the new Roman Empire. I know, it's genie-like, right? And the wish is that a remnant will be allowed to leave the city and go and set up camp somewhere else in Israel where Judaism can be saved, even as Jerusalem and the Jews are destroyed. There's another beautiful scene in the Talmud at Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai's deathbed, where he seems to sit there and, as he's dying, be overcome with the sense of, could I have saved more? Could I have done more? Was this all a mistake? Did I save Judaism and destroy the Jews? This is the foundational myth of rabbinic Judaism in many ways that we just looked at here. This is the center of the Pharisees' stories. And this is, in the end, how the Pharisees survive. The same way that Ezra and Nehemiah did, the same way that some of the Greek-connected Jews do in the temple, the same way the Sadducees did, which is by making accommodation and appeasement with empire. Okay. Thoughts, questions? That was our day.
How could zealots, if they were such a small portion of the population, end up with so much power?
So they took control of Jerusalem, closed the gates, and they were the ones with the weapons.
Okay.
And, these are groups and they are ideas. I don't want to push too hard on comparing them to Hamas, but right, it's all of a sudden things start getting real bad with the Romans and they're sieging your city. You're going to have a lot more people interested in being a part of your group who are fighting back, even as it's ultimately deeply destructive. Right, the rabbinic position of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai is sensible and not attractive. It's right, there's nothing romantic about it. There's nothing, let's accommodate the Romans while they're destroying, right? That's not, it's hard to get people to agree to that, even as he's right.
It is so easy to make the connection to Hamas, and you can't imagine someone from Gaza now going to Jerusalem and saying, let's make peace.
Yeah, exactly. Right, the humans are human. Okay, any other thoughts? Hopefully this was good. Hopefully we connected the larger story once again.
This could be a spiel for
to
something.
this. Yeah.
This could be a little...
Yeah. I think next week we're going to dig into Christian scriptures.
Okay.
Or I should say Jewish texts, Jewish messianic texts that eventually are taken and culturally appropriated by Roman citizens and turned into a universalist religion.
There you go.
Okay, we're ready for the big time.
Yeah. When you really think about it, by the way, this is going to sound real spicy, and I guess it is spicy, but Christianity and Islam are both global groups of billions of people who took our ancient tribal stories, culturally appropriated them, claimed them as their own.
It's true.
And when you look at all this from the perspective of Story of Us, that is how it is. Because all of a sudden, the Torah and the Hebrew Bible aren't scriptures. I hope that's one of the big takeaways we have from Story of Us, is to throw out this idea of scripture. These are our ancient tribal stories. That's what these are.
So if we all came back together and worked on the stories together, we should be able to find world peace.
There you go. Okay.
Find the stories of us.
Good to be with everyone.
Yeah.
See you next week.
Wow.
Rabbi, has your book made it?
Oh, yes. Thank you, Homer. I saw it in my mailbox today, actually. You're so sweet. And in fact,
I just wanted to make sure it made it.
I'm going to bring it out
My
next
pleasure,
week.
no?
We'll do show and tell next week with it.
Oh, is that the...
Oh, great.
What book is that?
Thank you, Rabbi.
We have an answer from Josiah. Judas Iscariot connection. The answer is maybe.
Okay, positive maybe.
Going for yes.
Reasonable academic answer.